Good morning and welcome. I'm Edith Juguna with Education Systems Center at NIU, and we are one of the 3 60 by 25 network organizers, along with Advance Illinois and the Illinois Student Assistance Commission. And this webinar is part of a series that we are offering on how communities are dealing with the challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. Today, we will be discussing strategies for engaging students, family, and staff through remote data collection. And we are very fortunate to have Susan Stanton with Act Now Illinois. She's also on the 60 by 25 network guiding team, and Alicia Garcia Flores from Enlace Chicago in Little Village, which is one of the 60 by 25 leadership communities, to lead us in this discussion. And I will now turn it over to Susan to lead us in our discussion.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. As Edith said, my name is Susan Stanton, and I am the network lead for After School for Children and Teens Now. We're a statewide organization that works with out-of-school time programs and community schools. And we'll dive a little bit more into what that organization is in a minute. But right now, I'd like to introduce quickly my co-presenter, Alicia. Alicia, do you want to introduce yourself quickly?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. I'm Alicia Flores, and I'm the Director of Evaluation and Data at Enlace Chicago. Been an after-school advocate and worker for many years in different areas in Chicago.
Great, thank you so much. So for today's presentation, I just wanted to go over some learning goals we're hoping to cover in our time together. So one is that we're going to hopefully help you identify tools for remote data collection and engagement. We're going to determine metrics for which you want to collect data, and we're going to summarize best practices in remote data collection. So just taking you through our agenda, we're going to start off just sharing a little bit about who Act Now is and what we do. We'll ground ourselves a little bit in why it's important to try to keep in mind some best practices in data collection during this time. And we'll also share some of what those best practices are. We'll go through some survey tools, and then we're going to dive into how to do this data collection by audience type. So we'll talk a little bit about what this looks like with students, family, and your staff and team that you work with. So what is Act Now? As I said, Act Now is a statewide organization, and we are advocating for quality and affordable out-of-school time programs. We also are part of a nationwide network. We're the statewide after-school network for Illinois, and there's a counterpart to us in all 50 states. That's been extremely helpful during this time as we've been able to share with our partners about all the different best practices that we've seen and kind of really just be able to resource share and know what's going on around the country. Our work is broken up into 5 key program areas. Part of what we do is policy and advocacy, advocating for programs and looking at things like their funding needs. But once programs are up and running and have that funding, we also want to make sure that they're supported to be as strong as possible. And so we do that through looking at things like quality improvement and professional development. We also have special projects that focus on community schools and STEM in the after-school space. So we wanted to just transition right now to talk about why remote data collection is important. And there's a couple things that are really important to keep in mind here. One is that when you're collecting this data, it can help you determine that you're providing the right resources and services and programming that are really meeting the needs of your community. It can help to examine your current practices and make sure that they're effective. And you also want to make sure that if you have a goal in mind, that you're actually working towards that and you're able to measure your progress towards that goal. It helps you improve in the long run, and super important to, I know, all of our organizations, it helps to communicate our impact when you're speaking with outside stakeholders and your funders. With all of this, though, I think it's important to keep in mind that some of these principles might be true for any data collection, but that for right now, you might have to pivot a little bit in order to be effective during this time of social. Now I'll turn it over to Alicia.
So in talking about best practices, I know as a for the quality committee now that I'm on, we wanted to kind of combine and share what we're learning across stakeholders right now in best practices in remote data collection, because we are dealing with a unique situation of COVID-19. So the way that we've done data tracking is going to be very different. So planning out what you're doing with your team and really addressing it head on is going to be really important. Developing some goals around what you want to be tracking, in particular, the activities and the engagement that you are doing. Not necessarily what you were doing is really, really important. I think the goal of doing a survey to capture what happened the last couple months in programming prior to COVID starting, you know, might not be as important or priority right now to developing a student interest survey, or maybe developing a way of tracking data right now as you're doing check-ins with families and students and parents. So I think it's really important to make sure that you as a team and within your organization, that you are discussing what's priority right now. For my organization, one example is we are spending a lot of time gathering resources and referral information that to, you know, because we can't be the end all for families, obviously, but also there's a ton of resources and information is being updated all the time. So we're tracking our group communications out to people and resource sharing as a team, so that we not only use that internally, but we're reporting that to funders as well. I think the most important thing is to not overwhelm your staff and as well as your families and participants. I think it's important to focus on what's doable right now. Checking in with families and making sure those relationships are intact and that people are being communicated with is priority for us right now. If I were to come to families right now and ask, you know, can you do this survey about that program you did like months ago? You know, it'd be like deer in headlights, right? We need to focus in on what are your, you know, not just what your needs are right now, but really gaining information from your participants about how they are strategizing as well. They have a lot of good resources to share with us as well. So we wanted to make sure that we're tracking that well right now. I think for us, thinking about program satisfaction or things that have happened, we're looking at, you know, one-on-one calls or small focus groups to kind of gain that and report to funders, but it's gonna look different everywhere. I think also thinking about what you're tracking with participants and thinking about what they're able to do, right, with as far as technology. For us, we are definitely asking families what is their best form to communicate with us. A lot of times that is phone call and text. People are still learning how to jump on a Zoom. We are also within, as far as data tracking with our doing check-ins with people, as an organization, instead of doing that so differently in different, like we have an education team, we have an immigration team, we decided to develop a check-in cohesively as an organization to make sure that we're asking similar questions so we have that data as well. I think it's important to also ascertain what funders really need right now and what requirements are needed, because sometimes we have to go to partners, go to funders as partners and say, you know, this is really hard for us. I know this is coming, but I don't think we can track this. We're tracking this right now, to be your partner in that as well. The other thing I wanted to mention is the follow-up with audiences, because following up, we're constantly gaining information and sharing information, but I think it's important when we do that, we aim to we use texting a lot and links so we might be sharing a resource on a Zoom, on a call, but we're also going to always follow it with people. And then lastly, making sure you know what's going on across your organization as far as sharing information so you're not bombarding people with too much right now.
We also wanted to share a resource on how to create questions for surveys that you might do with these different audiences. And so one of the links that we have here, and we'll also make sure these slides with all of these links go out after this webinar, but it has kind of like a longer document that talks about great survey questions. But overall, these are the best practices that we'd ask you to keep in mind. And so one, it's really important to avoid technical terms. I know, especially in the education space, there's so many acronyms and there's terms that we use all the time that make complete sense to us that to a different audience might not make as much sense. So being careful about that. You also want to really be specific about your questions, avoid complex sentences, and provide reference frames and answer choices that anticipate all possibilities and are unique. And so all of those things are important so that way you're actually getting the data for the questions that you're asking. And you're not kind of leaving questions vague so that way you might be getting a variety of different types of responses that don't really aim at the data you're trying to collect. You also want to avoid leading or emotional questions. You don't want to ask a question to just get a specific answer that you're looking for. You really want to make sure that you're gathering data and points of view back from your audience. So I'm going to go through and share some of the tools that we've seen programs using. So one is Kahoot, which is a way to do quizzes and surveys, especially I've seen this with students if you're doing a meeting. That's one tool we've seen people use. Another one that I think is super popular right now is Google Forms. I know our organization uses this a lot. I like Google Forms because I feel like it's really flexible. Everything goes right into an Excel sheet. And so I know that lots of people have been using that because it's also free. If your organization has a SurveyMonkey subscription, I think that some organizations have been using SurveyMonkey for a long time and might like that one. Some people just do polls in meetings like this one. Some people do regular kind of asking people questions, either in person or, as they're picking up different materials if they're picking up meals or something like that. One thing that I would share that I've found programs find very useful is if you haven't used it before, Bitly can just help create links and make them smaller. So you would just have a link that said Bitly and maybe one other word. And Google Forms links especially can be really long. So if you're going to be texting a link, that's something we found to be really helpful. So I'm going to pop up a poll right now. And I'm just curious to know, what survey tools are you using at the moment? Great. I'm going to end that poll and then I'm going to share the results. So it seems like a lot of you, similar to us, are really diving into using those Google Forms and have found that to be really helpful. And that quite a few fewer people are doing pen and paper. So now that we've kind of covered a little bit about who Act Now is, you know who Alicia and I are, you've learned some best practices about remote data collection and the tools that you can use. Now we're going to dive into talking a little bit more about different audiences and what remote data collection can look like. So in this space, we find that people most often are focused on students, families, and the teams and staff that they work with. Next slide. So we're going to start off by talking a little bit about remote data collection with students. So why do we bother to collect data on our students? So one thing that's really important right now is because this is a very unique context, is that you want to determine what they need and what they want. So that way you can make sure that you're properly addressing their needs during this time. You want to also figure out, if you're creating all these resources and putting all these services out there, you want to figure out if they're using them and what their reaction is to that. You don't want to create things and have them not go anywhere. Also, I think it's really important to keep in mind student voice at this time, that sometimes asking for their feedback can be super empowering for them to have a stake in whatever programming you're doing and what that looks like. And it's a great way to connect with them and make sure that they're hearing from you. When should you do this type of data collection? We often recommend that if you have a captive audience if you have remote learning hours going on, or if you are someone who's operating outside of the school day, if you're a community-based partner, sometimes it's really helpful to go to a teacher or somebody that student already has to check in with and maybe gather some data and feedback through them. Places that are helpful to gather data on students is you could do polls on social media. Facebook and Instagram make it fairly easy to do polls these days. You could do polls in your meetings that you already have with them, or again, just sending out an old-fashioned survey. In terms of what to track, things that we've seen programs tracking are things like remote learning hours, checking in with students to see how they are. And then outside of that, you could also think about other types of tracking that you might not have been normally doing. Things like social media, maybe diving into your analytics on Facebook to see how many views a video has gotten or what post has the highest engagement. If you're an organization that's working to hand out meals or other essential goods to students or families, tracking that. If you are handing out packets to students, I think it's equally important to track your effort in getting those materials out there as it is for what you get back from those materials. If you have remote learning agreements, and also keeping in mind who's in touch with which audience members. Alicia, do you have any other thoughts that you want to add on remote data collection for students?
Some things that have come up as we've tried to, my organization works a lot with high school students and we have middle school, but we have one school that's kind of diving in the elementary age for community schools. When you start to get in the younger ages, thinking about what we can use forms of platforms and technologies with kids is really important. So I see a lot of districts on here and people from universities. I think now more than ever, we need to be collaborating together to see what platforms are working, but also appropriate if we're working directly with students. So I think as much as we can have conversations about the kind of permissions we need as well, if we're directly communicating with kids, especially from CBOs, is really, really important. And then always I say, you know, how often and how much, and I think it addressed it in the slide to kind of tag along to other meetings potentially, or using other resources people are using with students.
Thanks so much, Alicia. We're going to do another poll, and I'd love to just know right now, what are you currently tracking with the youth that you're working with? All right, I'm going to end that poll and share out our results. So it looks like most of you are trying to keep that data on your check-ins, which is great. I think that being able to follow up with students after those and keep it straight in your head where everyone's going is super important. I'm so happy that people are tracking not only their learning hours, their face-to-face contact, but also just getting those materials out there, because I think that that's a huge effort during this time. And I'm glad some people are looking into social media engagement as well. But that's another thing that I think is something worth expanding on in this time. So this is one example of a tool ACT Now has created for a variety of organizations to use during this time. It's a student engagement and attendance tracker. It's just slightly different than what you might use to mark present or not present during a normal time. So what you can see on here is that there's places to add multiple students for separate weeks. This is set up in a Google Doc, so you can go in and you can copy it. You can change it around to use it however you want. But what's great about it is you can see from the screenshot on there is that you're not only checking attendance for something every day, but you can add in contact hours. You can add in, have you done a well-being check-in that day? Have you done meals received? And then there's other opportunities for different types of tracking on here. And so that's just another way of thinking about how you're going to kind of put all this data in one spot. And again, you can totally feel free to alter this as you need. This is just kind of a jumping off point that we've been providing to organizations. Another thing that we've created is a student interest survey. There's an example of this. We've just put it in a Word document, so that way you can drop it into whatever type of survey tool you're using, and you can, again, feel free to alter it to your needs. But it really tries to go through, and this is maybe something that's helpful to think about now if you're transitioning into summer programming. It could be a good time to reevaluate where your students are and what they need, but looking at things like what technology they have access to. How has remote learning been going for them? What's their well-being like? And then also, what are their interests? What do they want to see during this time, and what do they need? So another just helpful resource there. One of our great partners with ACT Now is After School Matters. They are an organization in Chicago that does after-school programming and career preparation for high school students in the city of Chicago. They do great work. One of the things I've been so excited about that they've been doing and sharing with their partners is they've been doing massive surveys of teens. Now, you might work with students who aren't just in their teen years. You might work with students outside of Chicago, and so maybe your data is slightly different, but I don't know of a ton of other people that have such great data on literally thousands of students. So I believe that there was about 3,000 students surveyed in this first survey. And so I put a link to their results there too. But it's just, I think that sometimes it's helpful to see data that other folks have collected to help you create your questions, and maybe it's a jumping off point if you don't have the opportunity to do a 3,000 person survey. I know that they're in the process of doing another survey, and they're hoping to share out those results too. So this one really focused a lot on when students are accessing technology and the type of technology they're accessing. They found some interesting things, such as that their teens, a lot of them had access to the internet, but a lot of it was through data, and that they were burning through their data to try to do student remote learning and things like that. And so I thought that was interesting, is that they would indicate that they had access to the internet, but then when they were asked again about it, After School Matters realized it wasn't actually Wi-Fi, and that was a concern, and that almost all teens were accessing their materials via a phone instead of a computer. So those are important things to keep in mind as you're designing programming. But that's just some helpful data for you to get started. So you've collected all this amazing data on students. You know so much about them. What are you going to do with this data So our suggestions for that would be that it can help you design your programming, decide if you want to kind of pivot in the subjects or the lessons that you're providing. It can help you determine the best way to check in with students. And if you're contracting with other folks who come in to offer services to your students, it can make sure that you're picking the right partners during this time. Alicia, any other thoughts on what organizations can do with data like this?
Definitely some of these tools we've been using that other people are already collecting this data to kind of tweak what we are asking in our check-ins. So we might not ask about certain aspects that students are already being, asked through other entities. I want to point to like it being able to tweak the questions you're asking. Because if we're looking at the data and it's like, okay, we were concerned, did all students, one of the questions we were asking, because we work a lot with CPS schools, is, did you get your technology? Are teachers communicating with you? At this point, we know already teachers have communicated and we know the kind of the issues or, what's going on with technology. So we're pivoting a little bit to change what we're asking. I think also at this time, going into summer, and flipping and talk about pivoting of what we're going to do with students, thinking about the dosage, the timing, and the platform we're going to use moving into the summer to engage students. So maybe they're more comfortable with just sticking with the one grade level versus naturally we'd probably put a couple grade levels of students in some programming during the summer. Obviously we can't do the same dosage as we used to do in person. So it's really helpful right now to kind of tweak what we're doing, but also.
So we're going to pivot to talk about a different type of audience. So now we're going to discuss what remote data collection looks like for families. So when we're talking about families, the reasoning why we want to collect data from them is, again, determine their wants and needs and figure out if they're using your resources and continue to build that connection. We all know it's incredibly important to addressing your students' needs and to really reaching your students is to make sure that their families are taken in along that journey. So that's incredibly important. Great times that we found people have found for getting information from families is when they're picking up meals at schools, if that's something that they're doing, or if they're at a different location picking up essential goods. That might be a great time to have some surveys there for them. Or even if there's one or two questions you want to ask from that person that's picking up the meals, that they're picking up the meals from and tracking that, there's different ways you can be creative around that. But overall, I think we all find that the best time to collect data from families is when it's convenient for them. And that might be a really individualized answer. And so for some families, depending on what their other obligations are at this time, if they're working, what other family they're caring for, all really important. So far, in terms of where people are collecting data from families, we've seen overwhelmingly that phone calls and texts are the most popular, but that I think more and more families are getting into the social media, doing anything we can to connect, especially if you're not able to reach families. We have found that phone numbers are certainly changing a lot during this time still. And so sometimes you might not be able to reach a family member on a certain phone number, but we've found lots of organizations having to jump onto Facebook and looking for families that way because they might still have access to internet even if their phone number has changed or if that phone number is not active anymore. I think a lot of folks are still using email, and that's been great. And then some organizations that we know were doing electronic newsletters and they decided it wasn't really working, and so they've gone back to snail mail and they've been doing that instead. So lots of different tools that I've been seeing. In terms of what to track, again, those check-ins are super important. I think especially if you're able to do those things one-to-one, I think it's when you find so much rich information and you can really tailor your questions depending on the responses that you're getting. If you have parent classes, attendance for those, again, social media engagement, you can look at your views along, as well as who is contacting that person. If you're looking for permission or consent for programming, That's a really important piece. And then we also added on here follow-up and referrals, which is something that I think Alicia touched on a little bit earlier. Again, if you're going to give them a resource, make sure that they actually have it, see how it's going, and if they're using it and what that's looking like. And then also you want to make sure that you know their needs, so you're able to address that. Alicia, other thoughts on remote data collection for families?
I think what more recently we've found is that a lot of our families we're working with, their phone numbers have been cut off. People are unable to pay bills right now, and it's been really challenging. So I think one thing that we've been pivoting to learn from is, and that we've always done, but we're really leaning on right now, is our parent leaders, and really having them engage with other families they know in the school and check in and kind of give us the information on how we can communicate with them, what's the best form. Once we've gotten some of those leaders comfortable with jumping on a Google Hangouts or Zoom, it's been nice. People really do appreciate seeing other people, not just like on a one-on-one phone call, but the group, and really kind of rallying with each other. So if you can do it, I think that's great. The check-ins are essential right now, one-on-one, for us to gather information rather than doing surveying. I think our parents are overwhelmed with alternative learning and working and the stress right now of what's going on. So I think also one thing I want to hone in on and just rally for is getting information from them. It's one thing, yes, everyone's checking in on what do you need, but once you give a resource too, like they're telling us, I went to that clinic and actually they couldn't help me, or the line was so long, or I found this resource that you didn't mention. So really using that as well.
Thank you. I love that. And even if you don't have a formal parent mentor or parent leader program at your organization, that's one thing that we found organizations are doing all across the state. I know there was this one organization in Bloomington that we work with, and one of the things that they've been leaning on is just parents who are kind of like natural leaders who maybe live in a larger apartment complex with lots of parents who have youth at that school or something. And then maybe one parent, when they go in to pick up, will bring multiple resources back to families that live near them too. And that's something that, so I think that there's lots of ways you can capitalize on that parent leaders. And sometimes they're talking to their neighbors and they know what's going on. And so they might be a wealth of information if you can find the right person. But I love that idea. Thank you. So we're all about the data and we're all about the trackers at Act Now. This is one of the ones that we created earlier in the COVID-19 crisis that lots of programs have started to use. But it's our family engagement tracker. And so again, it's a way for you to kind of pivot and maybe change how you are pulling in some of this data during this time. So this is set up again by different weeks, but it's also set up by the different mediums that you're using, which I kind of like because it can help you compare how much you're leaning into one method of data tracking versus another. And so there's opportunities for you to track your phone calls, which staff is doing that outreach. There's opportunities to do follow-up to that. If you're doing emails, what the social media interaction has been like. So lots of different ways to be tracking your family engagement in here. Again, it's just in Google Docs. You can download it. You can change it and manipulate it however works best for your organization. So this is a resource that we created pretty early on. And I think lots of organizations have gone this route of creating a community needs assessment, something to get out to your families to kind of determine where they are and how things are going. We have this in English and in Spanish. Again, it's just in Word, so you can drop it into whatever survey tool you've been using. And again, you can feel free to change it how you need, but definitely emphasize trying to get information out there in languages that your community understands and are comfortable with as well, to kind of meet them where they are. So one of our team members created this tool recently too, and it just has a bunch of the different types of tools we've been seeing families use. So like I said, calls and texts are really popular. With that, we certainly recommend that you make sure that you're being secure in how you're doing that and that staff are comfortable with it. The link that we have there is to, I know lots of organizations have been using a Google Voice, so that way staff don't have to give out their personal phone numbers. So things like that in order to kind of maintain the privacy and the boundaries for your team are really important. Facebook, we've seen be very popular with parents and with students. You can make private invite-only groups. You can do a Facebook Live. Maybe instead of doing a Zoom workout class, it's easier for you to post a workout video and then to track those and the engagement on it. We've seen lots of things like that.
Just wanted to mention quick too with Facebook, the messenger feature allowing for parent approval.
Oh yeah, that's a great point.
Looking at a lot.
That's one of the things we've seen with the younger kids too, is that they can, there's a way that you can give like elementary students access to Facebook Messenger, so that way they can message people, but they can only message people whose parents are friends with your parent as well. And so that's a way for if students have access to a device, they can call each other, send videos. I actually have a little person in my life who likes to do science experiments and send me their videos on Messenger, but it's great because their parent is allowed to track their communication with me. And so that's if you are working with younger kids, I think that that's a great way to do that too. Google Hangouts is another kind of video chatting service that's free that you can use. And I know that that's been very popular because CPS students are required to use that. Instagram, I think, is super popular with your teenage students, but I think also lots of parents are able to use that. Again, you can do polls on that. You can do stories and lives and just different ways of interacting. The Remind app is something we've seen being huge for parents. If you're not familiar with it, it's an application that there's a free level and then there's a paid level. And we've seen lots of districts during this time up their subscription, but it helps you send out mass reminder text and communicate back and forth with parents. And sometimes it's easier for organizations to communicate back and forth through the app rather than out through other ways. If you're using that, it's just also important that if you are school district related or if you're within your school district, that is a usable tool for your district. WhatsApp, I think, is also, it's another messenger tool, but that lots of families, that's one that we've seen be really helpful if families are changing phone numbers or if it's been harder to contact groups. That might be something you want to add to a parent contact sheet, is do they have a WhatsApp name? Because that's something that name might stay consistent even when a phone number changes as well. So would love to know of some of these tools, what are you using to track and to kind of engage with families? What are your tools look like at the moment? So we're going to launch another poll to kind of see what everyone's using at the moment. Okay, I'm going to end that poll and share our results. So this seems pretty consistent with what we've seen with other groups, is that there's no replacing those phone calls and text messages. Great to see how popular Zoom has been. I know that some organizations have done this where they'll just have an hour every week that's like an open hour for parents to just come in and connect with one another. It's not even formal programming, but they can talk about how crazy it is to do remote learning and things like that. It's great to see how many folks are using Remind. Someone chatted in MS Teams. Again, there's definitely a lot of different kind of like online face-to-face tools out there, just about finding one that your parents are really comfortable with. Looks like similarly people are using social media and Google Hangouts as well. So great to see what your colleagues are using in this space. So again, now you know what tools you want to use with parents, you know what you want to ask, you've collected all this great data, and what are you going to do with it? One is to design parent programming, if that's something that you do, where you do parent classes or things of that nature. Those topics might need to shift during this time. I think it's also, if you are gathering a lot of community needs, that's something that's really helpful to communicate to your administrators or your funders or even your local policymakers to figure out if you need to shift where your priorities are at the moment. And making sure, again, that you're referring people to the right resources. Alicia, other thoughts on what we can do with our family data?
So a couple ideas and things that have come up for us so far using that data has been to think about when we're actually starting the timing of our summer offerings. With students, we've also kind of pivoted to the topics, obviously the topic areas, rather than doing more, so kind of it's been half and half on academic, hanging from the school year and alternative learning, but also with SEL and just like mental health. For families and for students. So I think just being flexible and using this in an ongoing way and touch pointing with parents. And again, those those check-ins, this might be a platform, you know, an interest survey or whatnot, but those check-ins really tell us a lot.
So we're going to move into our final audience that we want to talk about. And I think that a lot of folks in the education space have been so focused on what students and families need that sometimes we don't think about those people who are executing this work and working so hard to balance everything right now, your team and your staff. So it's really important to make sure that you're supporting your staff during this time, because you want to make sure that they're supported so that way they can do their jobs. Again, it's you know, that old adage of put your oxygen mask on first. If the people you're working with who are caring for and serving your community don't have their needs met, it's going to be really hard for them to effectively do their job. Great times to be thinking about doing work like this is maybe during your staff meetings. If there's already paperwork staff needs to hand in regularly, like timesheets, maybe there's a way where you can add a couple questions to that. Or again, keeping in mind that they've got a lot on their plate, you've got a lot on their plate, so making sure it's convenient and not overwhelming for anyone. Where can you be collecting this data? You can try to do emails, surveys, and again, like we mentioned, on paperwork, they might already be filling out if you can just add a few questions to that. So in terms of what to track, you might want to be thinking about how staff is spending time. Maybe that could help you realize that like there's a certain task of like data collection right now that's way too time consuming and maybe it's not worth it. Or figuring out, you know, that they've not had enough time to do this as another essential piece. So maybe tracking some of that. And then really importantly here, I think, is staff needs. So checking in on their financial needs, their family health, their mental health. Do they have the access to technology they need to be doing their job? I know that technology has been an issue for some because it might be just this expectation that you can find a quiet corner in your home to go on a webcam, or that you have the internet access to do that. And all places and all people don't necessarily have access to that. And so I think keeping that in mind. And then also just personal bandwidth. If in the mornings you have to do remote learning, but you're also caring for your mother-in-law who's got a compromised immune system, there can just be a lot of different competing priorities. And so making sure that we're flexible to those two so that way people can still do their jobs. Alicia, I know we're going to dive into some more of these resources too, but any other initial thoughts for staff?
We can just move forward because we'll address that in another slide.
So I'm just going to do a quick poll here, is that I'm just curious to see what concerns you've been seeing from your staff and coworkers so far. Okay, we're going to share out these results. So it seems like personal bandwidth is a super important one, but that also mental health is right up there, along with these technology issues. So maybe it's comforting for you to see that your colleagues are feeling something similar too, or maybe this is triggering something you haven't been asking about with your team. So thank you so much for being willing to share what you've been seeing with your coworkers. This is just another quick tool that we shared. It's a way that you might want to tailor your timesheets during this time if people aren't just showing up. If you had staff members that were just coming in for a certain program time and now they're doing other activities, especially for some funders, they're looking for you to kind of keep track of that. So that is one tool that we have for you as well.
Another resources we wanted to share with you was an example. You can look at it as a needs assessment, but I like to look at it as a staff support assessment. And during this time of COVID-19, it's new challenges, new way of doing work. Staff are, like me, I'm a parent, I'm doing remote learning. God help us, I can't wait for it to be done. I'm sorry, it's important, I know, but it's overwhelming. Keeping track of all the emails, all the apps, everything, you know, and then thinking about the mental health needs of our staff members. You know, listening to participants and families and the issues that are going on right now, the advocacy we're doing. In Little Village, I don't know if you recently heard about the company dumping some toxic chemicals in the midst of everything going on right now in the community. So there's a lot going on right now. So staff themselves, making sure that they're equipped to handle this is really important to us. So I know that as an organization, we had been, you know, we have our regular check-ins, we're on a lot of Zoom calls right now, sharing what's going on. more than normal actually, as far as meeting with staff. However, we wanted to do a staff survey to really get in the nitty gritty of like what we could do to really support staff more. We know some of the issues going on, but what do you need then from this? So the goal was to make sure what we're currently doing is supporting staff, but the other things that kind of aren't happening that we need to be doing, and to get some new ideas. Because as a leadership team, you know, it just doesn't need to be in our bubble on how to solve this and how to address it, I should say. So the survey that I can show you, I mean, it's very simple. The link is there if you want to go into it later. But we developed this survey from scratch based on what we had been hearing, but developing it cohesively with a few staff members across our teams. So it was collaboratively developed. There's a lot of open-ended questions on purpose to let people kind of give their answers and not be prescriptive. I am fortunate to have a data and evaluation specialist on my team, VNA. She helped outside of me, so she's not on the leadership team. So I thought it was really great and important for her to be spearheading this outside of leadership as well, to get some really honest collaborative feedback. Our executive director messaged this survey in the link and encouraged people to give their feedback. I thought that was really helpful as well. The survey takes about 5 to 10 minutes, depending on how in depth you go, and it's 10 questions. But the areas are on coping and wellness, challenges and concerns that are COVID related, needs supports from the team, and question, comments, and suggestions, and in particular, leading people towards giving it to leadership. We really want to make sure that we get suggestions directly. So it did offer, I would say, you know, doing it more open-ended, that qualitative data takes more to analyze and to synthesize, but it was really worth it. We got a lot of really honest feedback. So some of the results and what we did with this was, you know, some of the results were like 76% of staff described themselves as feeling anxious, stressed, overwhelmed. Their families and colleagues overwhelmed because we had learned that spouses and family members that they're supporting, you know, what financial strains go on with them right now. 57% requested mental health services. People were requesting flexible schedules and got more explicit to what they meant. What in particular with mental health, one thing we did was we gave some clarity with our staff on what benefits they have already at their, you know, at arm's length with their insurance to be able, and we walked actually through the insurance policies, but also how to ask questions and how to potentially choose a mental health provider. One of our social workers on our team came on and walked through. That was really fantastic, how to find a match. We also decided that we're going to start summer hours early. We're doing lunchtime get-togethers. We did a get-together last week that was after hours too. It was really fun. Mental health, we did a training on vicarious trauma, which was really great. The flexible schedule, as I said, we're taking some extra days. We're reminding people of their PTO time to use. We're trying also to support it, right? How can you take PTO time if you feel like you need to be reaching out to families? We need to really support and say, okay, this is what we can do right now. This is what you can do right now. So to help staff say no, essentially, and to take the time they need for themselves. Supervisor support. So if I'm a leader on the leadership team and I'm not taking my PTO time, I'm driving myself into the ground. That's not really going to tell my staff members they can do it as well. So we really talked about that. And then we also talked about, you know, the worries about financial and job security, you know, with things going on like this, especially at the forefront of COVID-19 happening, people were worried about their jobs. Funders weren't being explicit to continuing funding. We have a lot of stipend staff, part-time staff. They're not on the ground. So we have to be extra communicative about what was going on with funding. So people knew about, you know, the safety of their jobs. And then continuing to find more funding for our staff. We actually got a loan program going so people could borrow money if needed for our full-time staff members. So just a couple ideas that we put out there based on this 10-question survey.
Thank you, Alicia. That's great. But we just wanted to take a minute in case you had any questions. But I just also want to thank everyone for sharing with us and sharing what things have been looking like for your program. The link we have on there is our website has a ton of different COVID-19 resources on there. There's e-learning resources, different online curriculums you can do. I will throw my email in the chat box. Alicia, it's totally up to you if you want to do the same in case people want to reach out with other questions as well. But we thank you again for participating, and we're happy to hold on a minute to see if there's other questions that come in.
Yes, thank you very much, Susan and Alicia. This is really useful information as we think about how we're engaging different stakeholders at this time. And I love the different tools and the really concrete examples of how they've been used and the results that you've seen. So if anyone has a question, we have a few minutes. You can put it in the chat or you can ask it verbally. As I said earlier, we recorded this conversation, and so we will share the recording with the network, and we'll share the link and the resources as well as other resources. We have a specific resource section on the 60 by 25 website around COVID-19. And we'll continue to provide avenues for folks to collaborate and continue the conversation and continue to provide direct results. We hope that you'll stay safe and healthy, continue to share your resources with us, and please join us next week, June 3rd, from 9 to 10 on a webinar on strategies for summer activities and youth employment. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us, and be well.